Now, obviously, that's sort of an unattainable concept. It doesn't really happen in the real world. No country's economy literally uses all of the labor supply and all of the capital stock and all of the natural resources. At any given time, there's going to be some labor supply that's not employed in the production of goods and services, and some capital that's not employed in the production of goods and services, and natural resources. Okay, so we can't literally achieve full employment, but sometimes economies approach full employment. Like they get relatively closer or relatively farther away from full employment. Okay, so to get back on track here, productive capacity is the total value of goods and services that can be produced by the economy when it works at full employment. Theoretically, we could put a dollar value on that. What would all the goods and services be worth if the economy was producing goods and services at full employment? Okay? So, again, to back up, back up and take a second charge at this, what Keynes is saying is that these fluctuations in the business cycle, right, these fluctuations in the business cycle that we see, over the course of time, result from these imbalances between aggregate demand and productive capacity. So, like at any given time, when you have this condition, okay, let's say you have this. Aggregate demand equals productive capacity. Imagine that these two are equal, roughly equal. Keynes says that the economy is in general equilibrium, as opposed to market equilibrium. Okay? The economy is in general equilibrium. However, at any given time, it could be that one of these two conditions hold. That aggregate demand exceeds productive capacity, or you could have a situation where productive capacity exceeds aggregate demand. Any thoughts about what economic condition this would suggest? If you had a situation where aggregate demand, the total amount of money available in the economy to be spent on goods and services, is greater than the total value of goods and services that the economy can produce when it works at full employment, what would that indicate? What economic condition would that indicate?
How about the oil industry?
No. What economic condition would that? I'm not asking for an industry. I'm asking for, we mentioned two economic conditions that we would like to avoid. Which one of those two? Yes, inflation. This would indicate inflation. Okay? When aggregate demand exceeds productive capacity. Economists sometimes describe inflation as too much money chasing too few goods and services. I actually remember that from my high school economics course. And that was a long time ago, folks. I actually remember my high school teacher in my economics course defining inflation as too much money chasing too few goods and services. I didn't really have a clue what he meant by that. I just remember too much money chasing too few goods. By the way, for you all, you all are too young to really appreciate why inflation is a problem, because during your lifetimes we haven't had a problem with inflation in this country. Okay? But you don't have to go back too far. Go back to the late 1970s and the early 1980s, and inflation was a major problem in this country, a major economic problem in this country. What, for ordinary folks, for people like you and me, I'm ordinary. I don't know. I shouldn't include you. I'm ordinary. I don't know. You may be extraordinary. But for ordinary folks, what is the problem with inflation? Why is inflation something that is bad? What happens during an inflationary period?
Money loses its value.
Yes, that's a pretty good way to think about it. Another way to think about it, or another, like the most obvious manifestation of inflation is that there are these, fairly, substantial increases in the general price level. The price of everything goes up, including the price of labor. So wages go up during an inflationary period, but they typically don't go up at the same rate that the price of everything else goes up. So groceries become more expensive, gasoline becomes more expensive, housing becomes more expensive. In other words, it erodes real income. And therefore, the quality of life suffers. People are poor during inflationary periods because their money doesn't go as far. Okay? It's very difficult, particularly for people at the lower end of the income scale, to sort of make ends meet because the prices of everything are going up. Okay? So inflation is a very painful thing when, countries have a rate of inflation like we had in this country in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. Okay? So that's the problem with inflation. The Federal Reserve Board decided in 1982, 1983, that this was a major economic problem for this country and it was going to bring inflation under control. And frankly, it did, and it has remained under control since the early 1980s. We haven't had a serious inflation problem in this country for that long. It's been a long time because the Fed tends to be very sensitive to inflationary pressure in the economy. And we'll talk about what the Fed might do when it believes that there's inflationary pressure in the economy. But let's put that off for just a bit. Now, what's the problem with recession? This is inflation, and this indicates recession. Okay? What's the practical problem for ordinary folks during this? Should be a little bit easier for you because you've lived through a recession. In fact, you've lived through a pretty serious recession. If you remember 2008, 2009, 2010, they were actually calling it the Great Recession. We had that sort of collapse on Wall Street, and the housing market went bust, and the economy went into recession, a very deep recession. But, what's the practical problem? Let me ask it this way. What do people worry about during a recession? In inflation, people worry about making ends meet. How am I going to pay the bills? How am I going to buy groceries, right? What do they worry about in recession? Well, they may worry about how they're going to pay their bills, but as a result of what? They're worried about losing their jobs. That's what typically the most outward manifestation of recession. That's what happens in recession. Look, businesses in a recession, businesses cannot move their inventory. Imagine a warehouse, and inventory is piling up on the shelves. They can't move it. So what choices does the business have to cut costs? Well, it can't cut its fixed costs. Okay, they're fixed, right? It can't cut whatever rent it's paying on, the warehouse or the, electricity costs and all that kind of stuff. Those are fixed costs. It looks to cut variable costs, and the most, sort of the easiest variable cost to cut right away is what? Labor, right? People lose their jobs because they start getting laid off because the business is trying to save costs, save money on costs. Right? So as people start getting laid off. That's the problem in recession. During the Great Recession, at the height of the Great Recession a few years ago in 2008, 2009, 2010, the unemployment rate in this country got up to over 10%, which was, pretty high because on average, and we talked about that in a very different context when we were talking about presidential approval ratings a week or so ago, but you remember over that whole period we looked at, it only reached 10% at two different points. Right? The average over that whole period was like 5.3% or something like that. So 10% is way above average. Okay, so those are the problems of inflation and recession. Now, to get back on course here, what is Keynes' solution to that? How can government sort of temper the effects of inflation and recession? Well, Keynes explains that government can adjust these imbalances by manipulating fiscal policies, monetary policies, or a combination of fiscal policies and monetary policies.